Hey there folks, the number one Freddie Gibbs and the Alchemist fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I want to talk about the new Freddie Gibbs and the Alchemist record, Alfredo 2, the sequel. If Freddie Gibbs and the Alchemist's respective career arcs have had just one similarity, it is the fact that their critical acclaim and more general commercial success have both, while never reliant on, have massively benefited from lengthy strings of collaborative projects, albums, and EPs alike. The Alchemist may have been working with legendary rappers like Pharoah Monch and even Nas as early as the late 90s and early 2000s, but his name became much more known to the average hip-hop head around the time that he released the 2013 Prodigy collaboration Albert Einstein, which caused the Alchemist to kind of more regularly attach his own producer name to albums that he produced the majority of. And around that same time, Freddie Gibbs collaborated with the legendary producer Madlib for 2014's Pinata, a record that elevated him to new levels of popularity that he had never yet seen before, with that record being arguably one of the most critically acclaimed albums, at least in the realm of rap, of the entire decade. So by the time that 2020's Alfredo rolled around, the two had become somewhat known for collaborating with various rappers and producers respectively, which meant that seeing the two in the same studio at the same time only kind of made sense, and the final result was just as consistent as one would hope for or expect. After all, Gibbs and the Alchemist, even now in 2025, are two of the most generally consistent figures in rap today, and it is rightfully recalled as one of the more memorable rapper-producer collaborations of recent memory. And now here we have Alfredo 2, a record that manages to live up to the fond memories that many have for the original project from 5 years ago, while nonetheless providing a new perspective on what Freddie Gibbs and the Alchemist are capable of together, never feeling like a cash grab made solely to benefit off of the name recognition of the original project, but rather a sequel that feels downright essential for anyone that even remotely enjoyed or was able to appreciate the first collaboration that these two did together as just Freddie Gibbs and the Alchemist. The original Alfredo was defined by a modern take on the sort of classic boom-bap sound that called back to the mafioso rap days of old, your Raekwon kind of sounds, without dating itself to a time period that it didn't belong to, and that is a sound that admittedly is nothing short of perfect for Freddie Gibbs' gruff personality behind the mic, and Alfredo 2 does manage to maintain a lot of those same tendencies, thanks to no lack of looped pianos and Gibbs' distinct, deep, kind of rugged voice, but the entire project feels significantly floatier than its predecessor, which is a bit of a surprise, though definitely a welcome one sonically speaking, with the Alchemist production here feeling significantly brighter and more colorful than it did on the two's previous collaboration with Alfredo, or even on the collaboration that the two did with Currency prior to the first Alfredo record with Fetty, an album that I would argue was also a little gruff in some places, and that kind of more colorful sound allows Alfredo 2 to stand out in the larger context of both performers' discographies, which are becoming increasingly extensive as the years go on. The twinkling keys that regularly appear throughout the record's runtime mix in perfectly with the airy drums and give Alfredo 2 somewhat of a shockingly spacey feel that is outright atmospheric in plenty of places from track to track, yet at the same time the whole thing remains grounded thanks to this series of rough and tumble vocal dialogue kind of samples that are more traditionally in line, or at least feel more traditionally in line, with the kind of tone that Freddie Gibbs bases his music on usually. And while I will say that Alfredo 2 doesn't really come as a big shock, at least lyrically or sonically speaking, if you are even remotely familiar with what Freddie does, or even with what The Alchemist does, it is still pretty undeniable that the two are a perfect pair for the most part at least, and that is something that remains true on Alfredo 2. As the other half of the dynamic duo behind Alfredo 2, Freddie Gibbs is as great as he's ever been. I mean, his overall tone and presence here are completely unchanged from the majority of his previous works, something that, again, will shock approximately none of his pre-existing fan base, but smooth flows of varying intensity being delivered in a baritone voice are what you will find on everything from Gibbs' earlier mixtapes to last year's pretty underwhelming You Only Die Once, and the same can be said about Alfredo 2. It's not a bad thing in any way, it's just that Freddie has a style and he digs into it here just as much as he does really anywhere else in his catalog, with the best moments here coming from him when his flow gets a touch more rapid, maybe just a bit more eccentric overall, which is something really interesting to always hear from him, as he really does kind of change things up behind the mic, as can be heard on tracks like Jean-Claude or Ensalada, the latter of which features a wonderful vocal performance from Anderson .Paak that I highly recommend for that reason alone. And if you had any love for a single second of Freddie Gibbs' admittedly very singular style on his past projects, then it's nearly a guarantee that this sequel will deliver the same quality to your ears, if not even maybe a little bit more, considering the slight differentiation that this record brings to the table sonically. Where Freddie Gibbs really stands out on Alfredo 2 is in his lyricism, which sees him return to the same level that he was at when the original Alfredo dropped half a decade ago, because he has put out a series of records since then that, while still varying degrees of alright to even great, have never really been quite as remarkable as lyrical outings, which is kind of a bummer considering that's one of the best things about the highlight records of his catalog. But here on Alfredo 2, he definitely gets back to his highlights again, with plenty of great punchlines and generally jokey bars that manage to weave their way into Gibbs' performance from one cut to the next pretty seamlessly, including lines like "Diss me on computers, I'm in Shibuya learning Japanese, that chicken talk, I speak that Trapanese" from I Still Love Her, a title stemming from the song of the same name by the J-rap group the Teriyaki Boys, yet another layer in the frequent Japanese iconography that can be seen throughout Alfredo 2, another way that the record manages to differentiate itself from its predecessor aesthetically speaking. Other lines like "Run through 'em, make 'em dookie," "Gas Station Sushi" from the album highlight Gas Station Sushi, a track that somehow just a couple of lines later manages to drop some powerful bars about white supremacy and how it encourages infighting and violence within black and other marginalized communities. And one could perhaps walk away from Alfredo 2 being a bit befuddled by Gibbs's frequently crass sense of humor and his tendency to bounce from juvenile to deathly serious lines like "a ping pong ball laughing through the pain," but he drops bars so confidently and with such relentless self-assuredness that virtually every single line lands. Sure, you could argue that maybe this isn't his best record from a lyrical standpoint, but I do think it is him returning to a degree of consistency and hitting pretty much every single landing for every single punchline, and even getting kind of vulnerable in some moments in a way that's really nice to see, especially after a few records that just didn't strike quite as hard for me from a lyrical perspective from him. So yeah, I really do think this is on the same level of the initial Alfredo record from a lyrical standpoint, which is saying a lot considering that's one of his best lyrical outings. Alfredo 2 is a record that does a wonderful job at carrying the legacy of the original collaboration between Freddie Gibbs and the Alchemist while still managing to set itself apart. I mean, just a single look at the album cover and seeing how it subs out the original's titular Alfredo noodles for some ramen immediately kind of clues the listener in on how, despite structural similarities, Alfredo 2 is a different flavor from the duo's first full-length excursion with just them involved. I mean, from the lighter beats to a way that Freddie kind of subtly introduces Japanese symbolics and imagery in ways not dissimilar to rap albums that embrace a mafioso-oriented style, Alfredo 2 is the sequel that the original record deserves, fully and completely, a true equal in every way, while being a subtly new direction entirely. It's hard not to appreciate this one if you found yourself even remotely enjoying its predecessor. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.